Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Ryan Truchelut from WeatherTiger, and you are looking live at Hurricane Nicole, a Category 1 hurricane which is just hours away from making landfall on the east coast of Florida, and it's going to spread widespread wind, surge, and rain impacts across much of the state over the next 36 hours. So I will be breaking down exactly when and where we expect all of those impacts to occur, both over the Florida Peninsula, overnight tonight into tomorrow, and then north into the Florida Panhandle later in the day tomorrow, and then through early on Friday. I'm going to wait just about 2.5 minutes until exactly 10 o'clock to start my forecast. I'll let the audience trickle in a little bit. If you, What you would like to do, if you have questions for me as a hurricane forecaster, please type them in the chat box, and I will do my best to address some of the questions that I see at the end of the forecast. So, all right, I will be back in exactly 2 minutes, and we will get this forecast started for Hurricane Nicole. Okay, it is exactly 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I am Dr. Ryan Truchelut of WeatherTiger, and if you're just joining us, what you are looking at here is Hurricane Nicole, which is moving just north of due west this evening and will be making landfall on the east coast of Florida in the wee hours of Thursday morning, and then moving west-northwest and eventually north across much of the state of Florida over the next 36 hours. So I will be discussing exactly what the surge, the wind, and the rain impacts are going to be across our state, and when and where you can expect the worst of it. So let's get started. Let's get right into it. There is a new advisory from the National Hurricane Center, and just coming up are the key messages for the 10 o'clock advisory, fresh off the press. Key messages from the National Hurricane Center that they want to communicate. First key message: hurricane conditions are expected tonight across portions of southeast and east central Florida. Hurricane warnings are in effect for much of the east central Florida coastline, and tropical storm warnings in effect for much of the Florida Gulf coastline, as well as areas further north into Georgia and the Carolinas. Key message number 2 for Florida is that a dangerous storm surge has already been occurring today and is going to be peaking in the overnight hours and into high tide tomorrow morning across really all up and down the east coast of Florida, and then even north into Georgia and South Carolina as well. And we'll also be watching for a damaging storm surge around the Florida Big Bend later tomorrow and into the wee hours of Friday morning. Probably the Friday morning overnight high tide being the worst here along the Nature Coast and in Appalachia Bay. The National Hurricane Center wants to remind you, don't focus on an exact track of Nicole because it is a gigantic storm. Tropical storm force winds extend over 300 miles north of the center of circulation. So exactly where the track goes has some implications for who gets the worst of the storm surge and where that surge occurs, especially on the Gulf Coast. But in terms of broader wind and surge impacts, especially on the East Coast, the exact track does not matter. And then final key point from the Hurricane Center is Nicole is going to be producing very heavy rainfall tonight through the day on Thursday across much of the Florida Peninsula. A lot of these areas already saw some extreme flooding rainfall with Ian just about 6 weeks ago, including along the St. Johns River Basin, as well as across portions of East Central Florida. So we're looking for isolated flash urban and small stream flooding through the day on Friday, and that'll also be extending further north into the southeast over Friday and then into the weekend. So the new track from the Hurricane Center, I'll reload. There it is. 10 o'clock track, hot off the press. Maximum sustained winds with Nicole 75 miles per hour. That's a minimal Category 1 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. And now you can see that the movement has turned a little bit north of due west. It's west-northwest at about 13 miles per hour. And it may even be picking up a little bit more speed than that in just the past few hours. So that southwesterly motion that we saw overnight last night stopped today. It moved pretty much due west across the northwestern Bahamas, and now is starting that gradual bend to the west-northwest, eventually over the course of the day on Thursday to the northwest, and then turning in the overnight hours north across the eastern panhandle and then up into Georgia by Friday morning. There's really been very little change to the forecast track over the last 24 hours. NHC forecast track still basically brings Nicole just barely back into the northeastern Gulf of Mexico here on Thursday afternoon. Doesn't re-strengthen it as it moves north because the waters are too cool there. But there is some wiggle room as exactly how far Nicole gets if it stays on land or whether it tracks a little bit further west into Appalachia Bay. And that matters for surge across the eastern panhandle. I'll get to that in just a minute. So this is the intensity forecast from the NHC, and right now Nicole is a Category 1 hurricane with 75 mile per hour sustained winds. That's going to be the landfall intensity. I don't see any further strengthening going on, and then we'll be weakening past landfall with no re-intensification expected, even if it just moves a little bit back over water later in the day on Thursday. This is the infrared satellite shot of Nicole, so these brighter white cloud tops are kind of the taller and deeper thunderstorms that are ringing the eye of Nicole. Air Force recon flying around in this storm right now has found a 40-mile wide circular eye, and you can see it on this infrared imagery there. So a lot of this eye is moving west-northwest, and it's going to be crossing the coast right around, we'll say, Port St. Lucie. The center will cross the coastline probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, but this eye is going to be tracking over St. Lucie and Martin County as we go through the very early morning hours, just 4 or 5 hours down the road from now. And that's really no change to the forecast there from what we've been looking at all day. Just very quickly, there's really no disagreement on the models at this point. We're talking about landfall occurring right around Port St. Lucie or Fort Pierce, between 1 and 3 in the morning. By the time it's 7 a.m., we're probably talking about Nicole Center being somewhere over the Kissimmee Prairie. And then tomorrow afternoon, say, we'll talk about 7 o'clock tomorrow, the center of Nicole's probably going to be somewhere in this region, either in Appalachia Bay or just tracking along kind of the northern nature coast. So that's kind of the range of uncertainty that we're talking about here. I do just want to mention that while some of the NHC models are kind of closer to land, the GFS continues to be focused a little bit further west. So a track into central or even west central Appalachia Bay is within the realm of possibility. We'll get up to the implications of that as we talk about surge going forward. So timing wise, just to reiterate again, this is an estimated radar from HWRF, the U.S. hurricane model. So this is what it thinks basically the radar is going to would look like right now going forward. We see that landfall occurring just north of Port St. Lucie in about 3 hours, 4 hours from now, and then a track inland over central Florida. By the time daybreak tomorrow, we're probably talking about a track over position over west central Florida, and then reaching back into the far northeastern Gulf of Mexico by the afternoon hours, and then in the evening pulling up into the eastern panhandle. So I want to talk now, switch gears and talk about impacts. And the first of the impacts of Nicole, the broadest impact, we're already feeling it, we've been feeling it all day across the Florida East Coast, is storm surge. Most of the Florida East Coast is still predicted by the Hurricane Center to see these 3 to 5 foot surge values above normal or high tide values. And that's all the way north into the Jacksonville area and even into south coastal Georgia, and all the way south to Palm Beach County, with a little bit lower values further south into Broward County. And that's ongoing. Again, probably the peak of these values, we're likely to see that peak value around the morning high tide, which is, I think, for most of these areas, between 6 and 8 in the morning. So just as a look, we can actually see this has already been happening. So there's some live tidal values, tide gauges along the east central Florida coastline. We'll just take a look at what some of them are showing right now. This is a tidal gauge at Cape Canaveral. We've gone through the evening high tide here, about 2.5 feet above normal high tide levels. Tide will be going out through about 1 in the morning and then coming back in until about 8 a.m. Here in Brevard County. So it's this morning high tide around 7, 8 in the morning where we're probably going to see the highest inundations along the coast. Further south here in West Palm Beach, again, this evening high tide has run about 1.5 feet, 2 feet above normal down there at Lake Worth. And then further north into the Jacksonville area, major surge impacts that far north too. The evening high tide that's ongoing is coming in about 2 feet above normal. Likely going to maybe be 2.5, 3 feet, even more above normal for this morning high tide around 8, 9 in the morning tomorrow morning. So surge flooding, it's been ongoing. We've seen A1A be overwashed in some areas, I know, around St. Augustine, Flagler County, and also even further south into around Fort Pierce, as well as even into northern Broward County. So widespread surge impacts, they're ongoing. They're going to continue through tomorrow morning before subsiding later in the day and into the afternoon hours on the East Coast. Now, switching gears to focus on the West Coast, NHC surge forecast now is calling for 3 to 5 feet of surge here in the eastern half of Appalachia Bay. Now, that's not ongoing right now. In fact, if you go back and look at the tide gauges in, say, Cedar Key, tides are actually running a bit below normal because we're seeing offshore flow right now. So let's take a look at the wind field here. Go back to our old friend, the H-Wharf, and go forward. There's landfall. There's Nicole moving onshore. There's all that onshore flow that's driving those morning high tides on Thursday morning that are going to be the most elevated there in along the East Coast. And then going forward, you can see this is Thursday afternoon, and you can see along the Nature Coast and in Appalachia Bay, you still have offshore flow. Winds are out of the northeast or they're out of the north, and that's going to push water out of the bay away from the Nature Coast. So, you may see those mud flats kind of open up here in Appalachia Bay, like you saw those pictures during Ian, temporarily in the late morning or early afternoon hours. Now, going forward into the evening hours. So this is just the H-Wharf's one opinion on what the wind field of Nicole might look like tomorrow. So this one's further west than most guidance, I will say that. But what you see here is that as we go into the afternoon and evening hours, that wind field switches around, and suddenly you're talking about onshore flow. You're talking about the wind pushing the water up through the very shallow coastal waters here along the Nature Coast and in Appalachia Bay and pushing it onshore. And that if that happens, if you do have a track that's far enough west where you have onshore flow developing, tropical storm force winds pushing that water onshore, that's how you will get those surge values of 3 to 5 feet here along eastern Appalachia Bay and into the Nature Coast. Now, if the track stays inland and the circulation continues to be, you're seeing more like a longshore flow, you're not seeing that kind of angle of attack being directly onshore, those values will be lower. So something to watch, still not completely certain, but of course be on the lookout for very dangerous surge throughout Appalachia Bay. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if 3 to 5 feet of surge in Appalachia Bay or the Nature Coast is going to put me at risk, well, the NHC has a great tool for this. You can actually go on the NHC webpage. I'll show you exactly what to do here. If you go to just the NHC main page, scroll down, and then click on Storm Surge Inundation, it will bring up a map. And there it is. We can continue, and then you can go right in and zoom right into where you live. If you live on the shore of Appalachia Bay or the Nature Coast, down here at Cedar Key, you can dig in exactly where the NHC forecast is showing surge coming in. So that's a very handy tool. I encourage everyone to use it if you have a marine exposure there. Now, looking at the next threat, we're talking about winds. Obviously, winds in and of themselves are going to be a threat here. As Nicole comes ashore around Port St. Lucie, it's really this area of coastal Brevard, Indian River, Martin, and St. Lucie counties where hurricane force wind gusts are most likely, including Cape Canaveral. Wind gusts are possibly going to be ticking into the 80 plus mile per hour range in this area with those 75 mile per hour sustained winds that Nicole's currently generating. Now, as Nicole moves further inland, these areas in orange are the ones there we can possibly see wind gusts of in the 50s and the 60s, and these areas in yellow are regions where we're probably going to see wind gusts of tropical storm force, 40 miles per hour or greater, but probably in the 40 to 50 mile per hour range. And of course, we've actually already seen a lot of tropical storm force winds up and down the Florida coast today. We've seen around 50 mile per hour wind gusts, really up to the Jacksonville area and south, all the way south, 60 mile per hour wind gusts on Cape Canaveral as of just a couple hours ago, and even south into Palm Beach County, wind gusts of 40 to 50 miles per hour all up and down the East Coast. This is the current wind field of Nicole. Here's the center. And these regions that are in brown and kind of white, those are the areas where hurricane force wind gusts are occurring. So they're all kind of happening north of the circulation center. It's this region that's where the more damaging winds are going to be. If we take a look at radar, you can see it's this kind of inner eye wall or partial eye wall. That's where those hurricane force wind gusts are going to be. And as this moves west-northwest and moves ashore during the overnight hours, you can see the regions that are likely to get those strongest wind gusts of potentially up to hurricane force wind gusts 75 miles per hour. So it's in here. All this out here, you're still seeing wind gusts into the 50, 60, 65 mile per hour range, but it's this inner core that's going to be doing the hurricane force wind gusts. This is the European model's idea of what the maximum gusts are going to be across the state of Florida over the next 2 days. And again, as Nicole comes inland here, it's the northern kind of eye wall or core structure as it moves inland that's going to be doing the highest inland winds. So this area of kind of Volusia, Seminole, Orange, Osceola, and Brevard County, south here into Indian River County as well. It's likely that area that you're going to see the inland winds of potentially 45 to 60 miles per hour, and it's this coastal region here where those hurricane force wind gusts are possible. For everybody else across Florida, I should also mention that these inland wind gusts that are the strongest are going to happen probably between 4 and 8 in the morning for East Central Florida. Now, I know most of these areas saw worse winds in Ian. That is true, but you can still have tree damage, power outages with 45 to 60 mile per hour winds, certainly. And then going forward, West Central Florida will get in on those kind of 40 to 50 mile per hour wind gusts in the late morning, early afternoon hours. North Central Florida, inland areas start to see those low-end tropical storm force wind gusts in the afternoon. And here in the eastern panhandle, probably talking about afternoon hours into the evening and overnight hours when you're going to see those, and early into early Friday when you're going to see those wind gusts of, say, 40, 50 miles per hour here across the eastern panhandle. Much lower winds as you go west across the western panhandle. So again, those areas that see those inland tropical storm winds, you could see tree damage, you could see power outages. These areas that are highlighted in red here on the National Weather Service warning map, there's inland tropical storm wind warnings in effect. So those are the areas that could see those 40 plus mile per hour gusts. And they spread over, again, that's covering all of the Panhandle, that's east of the Apalachicola River, as well as all of west central Florida, east central Florida, and down. This is the hurricane warning zone here along the east central Florida coastline. So the next threat that I want to talk about is flooding rainfall. This is kind of the last of the major threats that Nicole poses here. These areas that are highlighted in orange are regions where there is potential for moderate flooding rainfall, both flash flooding as well as exacerbating ongoing river flooding along the St. John's Basin. Now these areas, back to the warning map, these areas that are kind of shaded more darkly here, there's a flood watch in effect for those areas, and what the map is kind of overlaying a couple different warnings on top of each other here, but that's what that darker region is. This is the flood watch area as it currently stands from the National Weather Service. So when we've already seen some very heavy rainfall just over the last 48 hours, some of these regions of east central Florida that do not need additional rainfall have already seen 2 to 3 inches. We've seen 4 to 6 inches here along the southeast Florida coastline, more broad area of kind of 1 to 2 inches over the eastern half of the Florida Peninsula. And going forward from now, again, east central Florida is looking for another, generally 2 to 4 inches of rainfall, heaviest overnight into the morning hours. Western portions of west central Florida up into eastern portions of north central Florida, 2-3 inches of rainfall likely. And then here in the eastern panhandle, again, probably somewhere on the 2 to 3 inch range for precip. We really need it out here in the eastern panhandle where it's just been parched for the last 2 months. 2 inches isn't going to break the drought, but again, we have seen these numbers generally trend higher with time. So Tallahassee, 2 inches of rain, I think that's your benchmark right now. We'll see if we go higher from there. Again, if you get that rain in a short amount of time, it could cause some flash flooding potential, but it'll be primarily beneficial for us up here in the Panhandle. And I just wanted to double check. This is basically the very latest severe weather reports from all the National Weather Service offices across the state. Doesn't look like there's any. Just was checking for tornado warnings or any particularly significant ongoing severe weather. So with that, I'm going to switch it back to the infrared. There's Nicole. There's the eye. 40 miles wide, heading for Port St. Lucie. Fort Pierce, center of the circulation is going to be there 1 to 2 in the morning. The eye itself is going to be arriving, as early as the midnight hour here in St. Lucie and Martin counties. So with that, I will see if there are any questions. Okay, let's see. What do we have? Tornado risks. So the tornado risks are primarily along east central Florida into northeast Florida overnight tonight into early tomorrow. There have not been any tornado warnings as of yet that I have seen. But of course, that's something that we always watch for with these outer bands of landfalling tropical systems. Keep a way of receiving tornado warnings on hand through the overnight hours. They can spin up very quickly in the outer bands. Not expecting a huge tornado outbreak, but something worth mentioning. Will Nicole speed up? Yes, a little bit, and we're seeing that already. It's probably going about 15 miles per hour right now. I would expect as it moves, along this general path, that it would increase to say 20 miles per hour of forward speed and through the day tomorrow, and that's going to hold those rainfall totals down. The fact that it's moving 20 miles an hour as opposed to 8 to 10 like Ian was makes a big difference in terms of rainfall totals. Wind speeds in Melbourne, peak wind speeds, I would guess you're going to see higher end tropical storm force winds. We've already seen a wind gust of 60 miles an hour on the Cape. I think Melbourne has cracked 50, so you're definitely going to crack 60 for wind gusts. As this, we'll go back to the radar. Here you are in Melbourne, and this nasty little guy is heading your way. Ooh, 3 or 4 hours. So 4 to 6 hours from now, that's when this will be moving through, and that's when you'll see those 60 plus mile per hour gusts. We'll see how high you get. Next up, Naples and Port Charlotte impacts. Thankfully, Southwest Florida is going to see pretty minimal impacts here with this track across the state. The winds are going to kind of be along shore, so you're not going to see a surge. I think coastally you will see wind gusts of 35 to 45 miles per hour along the immediate coast. Obviously not great for places that have just had immense wind devastation to have any kind of elevated wind, but not looking at any kind of repeat of damaging winds in any way, shape, or form for Southwest Florida. And finally, let's see. I saw one more. Right. How far west of Apalachicola do you expect to see effects from wind and rain? Great question. I would say that I think we will be, if you go back to the NWS rainfall map, and here it is. So the dividing line between this kind of sharp gradient between 2 to 3 inch rainfall totals east of there and then sharply dropping off to very little west of there, it basically runs right through Panama City, somewhere in this kind of Apalachicola River, Panama City line. So, that area, whenever you see a gradient like this, that could always move a little bit further east if the storm tracks inland, or further west if it tracks a little bit more here into western Appalachia Bay. But that's the general dividing line, somewhere here in the Apalachicola River Basin. All right, well, I think I'm going to wrap it up now. Stay safe, Florida, here in the overnight hours. You're going to see the worst of it through the early morning hours here along the Space Coast and the Treasure Coast, and the worst of it kind of in the hours pre-dawn to daybreak here in East Central Florida, and then the kind of the late morning hours here into West Central Florida. I'll be back tomorrow with additional coverage, and I'll be focusing on what's expected for North Florida at that time. But for tonight, I'm going to sign off. This has been Dr. Ryan Truchelut of WeatherTiger. Stay safe, Florida, and keep watching the skies.